Imagine it is a quiet Sunday evening in 1938. You are sitting in the living room with your family, listening to the evening music program. Without warning, the music cuts off. An announcer breaks in with an urgent news bulletin. A mysterious object has crashed somewhere in America. Over the next few minutes, the reports escalate. Strange creatures are crawling out of the wreckage. The local military forces are being wiped out. Entire cities are engulfed in flames. Across the country, listeners reacted. People threw their belongings into cars, jammed local police phone lines, or strapped on whatever protective gear they could find, preparing for the end. In less than an hour, thousands of people believed the planet was under an active alien invasion. But there was no threat. The panic was entirely manufactured. No spacecraft landed that night, no cities burned. The Earth was perfectly safe.
The entire apocalypse was the work of a 23-year-old theater director named Orson Welles, who was simply putting on a science fiction radio play. So how did a young man reading a story into a microphone bypass the critical thinking of a nation and convince them the world was ending? To understand the reaction, we have to look at the technology of the era. Television was barely a concept in the late 1930s. The radio was the undisputed center of the American living room. It was where families got their evening entertainment, but more importantly, it was their lifeline to the news. Because of that reliance, the physical box in the corner of the room held an implicit authority. If a voice came through that speaker delivering a serious report, audiences were conditioned to accept it as absolute fact. Wells understood this trust. Instead of telling his story like a traditional audiobook, he dressed his fiction in the clothing of urgent journalism. Inside the studio, actors adopted the frantic pacing of on-the-ground reporters. They brought in fake experts to deliver scientific-sounding analysis, and they layered the broadcast with visceral audio effects of explosions and screaming crowds. The network didn't try to hide the trick entirely. They explicitly stated at the very beginning of the hour that this was an adaptation of the War of the Worlds. This timeline of the broadcast shows exactly where things went wrong. The disclaimer played right at minute 0. But about 12 minutes in, a massive wave of listeners turned the dial to this station. They missed the warning entirely. Dropped right into the middle of a screaming reporter and terrifying sound effects, their brains relied on the familiar format of a news bulletin to make sense of the noise. They didn't hear a play, they heard a live national emergency. Today, historians studying the event have uncovered something surprising. While genuine confusion definitely happened, the nationwide mass hysteria was a myth. This front page from the Daily News shows exactly how that myth started. Fake radio war stirs terror dominated publications across the country the very next morning, vastly inflating the number of people who actually panicked. Newspapers were actively losing their advertising revenue to the increasingly popular radio networks. By framing the broadcast as a dangerous disaster, print media hoped to convince the public that radio was an irresponsible and untrustworthy platform. The infamous broadcast was actually a double deception. A clever director tricked his listeners on a Sunday night, and the newspapers tricked history the morning after. At the end of the hour, the actors dropped out of character. Wells said goodnight to his listeners, and the terrifying illusion vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Yet, the War of the Worlds remains the most studied piece of audio ever produced, serving as a permanent proof of concept for mass deception. It exposed a vulnerability in how we process information. When a lie perfectly mimics the tone, style, and structure of authoritative news, we are highly likely to ignore the absurdity of the facts being presented. That vulnerability did not disappear with the invention of television or the internet. As our digital feeds fill with information designed to look like trusted reality, we remain just as susceptible to manipulation. A 23-year-old on a microphone proved that you don't need real monsters to induce panic. You just need a perfectly structured story.